My name is Jonathan Beer. I'm a licensed clinical social worker working at Ruth and Norman Rails Jewish Family Services in Boca Raton. I'm also a student at the Doctor of Social Work program at Barry University. And most importantly, I'm the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors. May their memory be a blessing. I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with directors Susan Fanshel and Veronica Selver from the movie Irmi, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you for joining us. So can you tell us a little bit about yourselves, your background, and how you got into filmmaking and directing?
You have us stumped already.
Oh, wow. Okay, well then, where are you from?
We can handle it. Susie, you start.
Well, I got into filmmaking through the arts. Originally, I didn't go to a film school, but I was at the University of California studying, getting a fine arts degree in a Master of Fine Arts, and had a teacher who asked us all to make films without any particular training. In any case, I ended up getting very interested in film, and then had the opportunity to work at the Extension Media Center at the University of California, where I really apprenticed. And I've been making documentary films ever since. So I've worked on the West Coast. I ended up living in Europe for a couple of years and then moved to New York, and I've worked as an editor primarily, but I've also produced and directed my own films ever from the beginning. So it was sort of a kind of pay Peter with Paul's money and all of that. I mean, in other words, the films I made were not ever, were mostly made with grants and with very little money. They were all projects of love for the most part. And I worked professionally as an editor to be able to make those kinds of choices. And so I don't know if that's of interest, but that's my background.
Thank you.
And Susan lives in New York.
Okay.
And I'm Veronica, and I live in Oakland, California. And Susan and I have been dear friends since high school. And we coincidentally had a kind of parallel professional trajectory. I also became interested in films, in film work right out of college. I went to City College in New York and started working in cutting rooms. I was really an apprentice, assistant editor, sound editor, and editor, which was the sort of the course that one could take at that time. And I was also principally an editor. I worked almost exclusively on documentary films. That's been my field and what I've been interested in. I did also work in Europe for a few years. I worked in France. I worked in dubbing and subtitling and sound editing. And I came to California as a sound editor in 1975 in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's the only non-documentary that I've worked on. And then I stayed in California. I'd come from France and New York. So I've been here ever since. And Susan and I have worked together on films in the previously, particularly on a film about a radio station in Berkeley. And we came together to work on this film early.
Amazing, thank you. And you co-directed this movie together, right?
Right.
So I was wondering how does that work? I'm sure that directing a movie by yourself is hard enough. So doing it with someone else seems like a challenge, or sounds like a challenge.
I don't know. I think that maybe because we know each other so well and because we worked together before, it felt very natural. The kind of flow of ideas and we, you know, we had distinctly different relationships with the subject.
Right.
Although I did know Irmi and for many years, but I'm not her daughter, so I had a certain I was, you know, able to be in a different relationship than if it were my mom. But the directing and the editing, I think was not a struggle. In fact, I think neither one of us would have been wanted to be alone with the project. I mean, two was better than one in this case, I think.
Thank you.
Many a time, the expression "two heads are better than one" showed up. And to add to that, it is a film about my mother, and there is no way I would have been able to finish it if I began it. If I just began it a little bit, there's no way I would have been able to do it without Susan in particular. I did need to work with specifically Susan because of the depth of the trust that we have in each other, and it's a personal subject,
yeah.
And yeah.
Mm-hmm. And most of a big part of the script was Irmi's memoirs. So I'm wondering, how was it to take those memoirs and kind of like use parts of them, decide which parts to use?
Well, I can start with saying that when I began working on the film, I did not have Irmi's memoirs in mind, and I was just sort of playing with material that I'd shot of Irmi. And when the memoir came into the picture, when the idea for the memoir came into the picture, that became the saving structural element of the film. How we decided what to use and what not to use, Susan, maybe you can address that.
Well, some of it was a kind of what aspects of the memoir were central to the story. I mean, that was very clear, you know, that there were central themes and that she expressed and told in a certain way. And then details, you know, in other words, the kind of thing that really made it particular to her story had a lot to do with what we could bring to life on film. And there were certain things that happened through the discovery of pictures or archival material or ideas that we'd have that would allow just a very vivid sense of the memoir to come in. So it was kind of a give and take. You know, we were always kind of going back and forth until we kind of got it down to the essence of what we wanted to use.
Yeah, the archival material in the film is pretty amazing. Like there's that news article about the ship that was bombed, and it's specifically about Irmi, even though I don't think it said her name, right?
No, it didn't say her name. It didn't say her name. That's right. It was from a small local newspaper in England, because Irmi wound up in England, and she wound up in let's say a suburb outside of London that had its own newspaper. And at the time that Irmi came to England, the war had just begun, and Germans were considered enemy aliens, and it didn't matter at the time whether you were Jewish or not. In other words, you were German, you came in as an enemy alien, and so you went before a tribunal. My mother went before a tribunal to determine whether she was, whether she was trustworthy, I suppose. I'm not sure what they looked for, but the article states that it was evident that Irmi was, still in such a state of distress that they had sympathy for her and they dismissed her very quickly, and she got through that perception of enemy alien.
Mhm. Wow, that's amazing, and wow, really gives me goosebumps to think about it. Thank you for sharing that. And in the film, I noticed that Irene, which is, I guess, your sister, right? She mentions feeling the need to protect Amy from more pain, and that's something that I think I mean, I know from my family and also from people that I work with, that it's something that a lot of children of Holocaust survivors feel like they need to do, or it's their duty to do. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, I think from the moment that we were born, because people sometimes say, well, when did you find out about your mother's tragedy?
Mm-hmm.
And both Irene and I, neither of us can say when we found out. It's just something that we always knew. We have absolutely no recollection of when it was told to us. It's just something we were born into. And along with that was a sense of protectiveness, a sense somehow that we felt always that we wanted to avoid more pain for Irmi. And I don't know, we expressed it probably in different ways. Irene might have expressed it in her particular kind of caring.
Mm-hmm.
I expressed it in wanting to make my mother laugh. It was something that, for some reason, as a child, reassured me that she was happy, or and so we cared for her in a particular way, and she I wanted to say she accepted that. By that I mean that she expressed in her later life the need for that.
Wow.
The need for our for our protectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it. I'm not saying it very well. But for example, just a very tangible example is she called both of us very, very often when we were adults and we no longer lived with our mother. And those phone calls were an indication that she needed us to continue to be present with her, I would say.
Yeah, that's mentioned both in the beginning of the film and towards the end. That I think I can't remember who it was, but somebody said that they felt like she was very social in one way, and then kind of anxious when she was alone.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And Susan, being a very, very close friend and knowing Irmi, since high school, our friends also experienced Irmi's kind of anxiety and protectiveness toward us and need to be protected too.
Yeah.
So Susan, you got to experience her, I guess, hospitality and how she treated neighbors and friends.
Oh yes, absolutely. And she was very, very unique and vibrant and alive and caring person, and she made you feel instantly at home, and she was just. But it's interesting because I met Irmi when I was in high school, so I was quite young, and one's observations of one's friends' parents are very different at that age than as you grow older and get to know them as an adult. And I did know her for, I think we figured out it was about 30 years, but not once did we ever talk about the tragedy. And what this film allowed me to know much more intimately was what really had happened in her life. That was not something that was ever part of a conversation. And so many people who knew Irmi because they were friends of her daughters said the same thing, that it wasn't something that she revealed as part of, and certainly there was a great deal of intimacy in my knowing her. I mean, I was a guest in her home, Veronica and I were in each other's homes all the time. She knew my parents, I knew Irmi. It was a very close connection, and yet there was that unspoken part of her past. And Veronica and I had more discussions about it making this film than we ever did up until recently, right? I would say.
Yeah.
May I add something to that?
Of course.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about the film is that I think we all have more than one life. We have other lives inside of us. And we live with these other lives as well. They're internal, they're of the past. They sometimes they come from, for example, if you speak more than one language, you can sometimes have almost a different life in another language, a kind of different persona. And so my mother carried another life, if not more than another life inside of her. And it was there, it just was within and I think that's probably, something that I thought about in relation to the film, that's true for many of us.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting insight. I guess into any person, the duality or more than duality of our different social, right, our different, what we are in different social terms. Thank you for sharing that. And you were talking a little bit about Irmi and how the film really shows, has a very optimistic, or at least that's how I saw it, a very optimistic kind of point of view from the beginning to the end, even when it touches on the more difficult things that happen. I think Irmi's optimism and love of life is really shining through the film. So I wanted to get your feedback on that.
I think, well, I'll say two things about it. One thing I'll say is that I think that, it was in part her nature. I think I think it's possible that she just had a natural disposition toward a kind of openness to living, and she maintained that. Another aspect of it, which is again something that I hadn't really thought about before, is that her resilience, if you want, is something that came with her experience. It manifested when she needed to when she needed to live it, to experience it, to draw it out. So she maybe nurtured a certain optimism out of necessity.
Yeah.
And also had a kind of predisposition toward it. I don't know. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. Is the question that this spirit that comes through the film is one that we consciously strove to portray, that we structured the film around that, or whether it's something that kind of developed from the material? I mean, I think it's more the latter. You know, in
Mhm.
other words, I didn't think, never did we say, this is going to be an upbeat, you know, optimistic, you know,
Mhm.
antidote to blah blah. You know, we didn't approach that. I think at a certain point we sat back and sort of were amazed ourselves by the spirit that came through. You know, in other words, it wasn't something that we were controlling as a trait that we wanted the film to have. Like it would, you know, we were really trying always to be true to our subject and her spirit for, you know, which, and I hope that that happened, you know, that she's a many-dimensional person, because she was certainly.
Yeah, that's certainly what I got out of it. You know, even there's that it's kind of like a short video. I think in France it's black and white, where she opens the car and like 12 children walk into the car and sit down. Everything just, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Always a smile on her face, just amazing.
She had a life force, that's for sure.
Yes. Yeah. Um, one of the scenes that were more kind of that really struck me was when Fred Bauman says that Irmi asked him to bring her a brush and a mirror, and she said, "I've decided to live." For me, as a viewer, that really struck me. So I can only imagine how powerful it must have been for you, who her daughter and someone who knew her.
It's definitely a key moment in the film. I'd say it's a real it's a turning point, or it hits a deep level in the film. It you know, and it's a kind of revelation. It's a kind of revelation that Fred was able to bring to the film. That yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very important moment in the film. Both the fact that she said that, and also the way Fred describes that her memoir, and in this particular place, it's evident, her memoir did take on a kind of upbeat, a kind of, I wouldn't say upbeat, but the memoir did not dwell on the really dark moments that she lived through. And Fred really helps us feel those at that moment when she decides to continue living. What do you want to add to that, Susan?
No, I don't. I think you said it really, really well. Yeah. I think it is something that, you know, that was a gift to Veronica, and then of course to us as the audience, because she would never have, I mean, that is not in the memoir, and it is something that he comes the closest to that moment in her life that was just, nobody can imagine, you know, that kind of loss. And so he gives you a little bit of a window into something that he was present for. And he was a young boy at the time, you know, he was a child, but it stayed with him. You can feel that it stayed with him, how powerful it was for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely came out in the movie. I mean, you could really sense the energy of him saying that and realizing the meaning behind it, you know, behind the words.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very powerful moments. Mhm.
I mean, yeah.
Please.
I say, I only wanted to say that that that's one of the gifts of documentary filmmaking, that when you start to explore a subject, you're open to finding as much as you can about it, you don't always know what you're going to find. And I I I found Fred Bauman. He's someone who obviously knew my mother when he was a young child, um, and had stayed in contact, but I had no idea that he was going to reveal that. And that's sort of a gift in filmmaking. Things occur that you don't anticipate, that just give you so much in the course of discovering your subject.
Yeah, it's really truly amazing. Yeah, and then we get to I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in the movie, but then we get to the part where Irmi gets to New York. And one of the things that I noticed was when she talks about being on the subway and seeing someone just casually read a Yiddish newspaper, like, there's no, like with no worries. That must have been amazing and, shocking in a good way for her. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Well, the only thing to say about that is that Irmi loved New York. She just, New York was her city. Oh, 100%. And it had to do with that quality of feeling safe as a Jew in New York. And it just, as well as the whole expansiveness of the city and the liveliness of it, which very much suited Irmi. But that feeling of being of safety as a Jew was obviously huge in that subway ride, and stayed with her always. She lived until 2004. That subway ride was in 1942, and she never wavered in her love of the city.
That's amazing. Wow. And then we get to the part where, of course, she meets your father, right? And they get married, and there's another part where where your sister Irene says that she knew that she was named after Irmi's daughter Irene, but she thought that Beatrice was your father's addition to the name.
Yes.
And then she found out that it's actually that was her full name, Irene Beatrice.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah. I don't really have a question about that. I just thought it was so interesting the way she talked about it and described it.
Yes.
Unless
yes.
you have anything to add.
The only thing I have to add to that is that our dad died when we were 13, 14 years old. And it's really, when you think about what you would want further from your dad, from your parent, if he or she had lived longer, it's something I've always wanted to ask my dad, why he accepted that. Why it was okay. He was a wise man. He was an educator. He worked with kids. Why it was for him the right thing. He didn't resist that, because so many people have said, "Oh my God, your mother gave your sister." I mean, a lot of people respond to it in a kind of, what a burden for Irene. And I think my father must have understood something. I would have loved to ask him about it.
Wow. Yeah.
So but Irene survived very well.
Okay. You know her better than I do. Okay. And then obviously a lot more happens. I'm kind of looking at the notes that I wrote to myself, and I just noticed that when there's the part where she wanted to buy the house in Cape Cod, and she went to the Tel Aviv University and kind of negotiated with them for them to pay for a painting that was lent to them by her and Carl, which is sounds just amazing to me.
Well, I do want to specify that at the time that she bought the house on the Cape, it was a whopping $16,000.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're not talking about the millions that happen in the art world today.
Yeah.
It was a pure exchange. I will say one thing about that, which is that my mother, one of her gifts, I really feel it a gift, was that she maintained her connections. She maintained with, like for example, Carl, who was her first husband who died. Carl had a brother and two sisters. They were our aunts and uncle. That's how we, tante this, uncle that. And she maintained close relationships with that whole first family, close relationships with Daddy's family after he died. So the fact that she was able to come up with that and negotiate it was part of having maintained a kind of aliveness about her previous life. I see it that way. It wasn't like, it was just sort of part of the landscape of her life, that she knew that some of the artwork was in Israel. It was Palestine at the time. It was,
Yeah.
it was lent in the 30s.
Yeah.
And so that's how I see it. In addition to, being a really wonderful exchange.
Yeah, a wonderful exchange. And also, I can only imagine the guts it would take to approach a museum and right and ask for that. Or at least for the way I see it, it would take a lot of guts.
Or an ardent desire for that house.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said in the beginning, I'm a social worker, and I couldn't help but notice the social work aspect. Right, your father was working in a social work school, and that even took you to France. And you also mentioned that, or the film mentioned that Irmi kind of kept taking on, different roles, right? And at some point, and then she found herself the wife of a social worker. So I was wondering if you had anything to add about that.
That line or that idea comes from Irene, from it. The idea there is that my mother was after our father died, she maintained a certain independence from that moment forward, if you want. She never did remarry, and the sort of the spirit of that remark is that she sort of, once she kind of struck out on her own, that she appreciated a certain independence that she may not have had in quite the same way as a married woman, either with her first or second husband. She did have a middle husband for a very short while, but she was able to leave that marriage. I mean, the only other thing I can say is that, of course, she loved being a hostess. Mm-hmm. That when she was our father's, when our parents were married before my father died, my father did have a school of social work in France, and Irmi was a wonderful, wonderful hostess. Whenever foreign people came, my mother was the one who showed them Paris. Whenever we, when there was breaking the fast, it was always at our house.
Mhm.
The entire staff came to our house to break the fast. She loved being a hostess, and she loved that role. And she continued to be very much of a hostess.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
that's definitely shown in the film.
Yeah.
So yeah, is there anything that this is my first time asking directors of a film about their movie, and as you can see, I'm a social worker. I'm not really a film person. Even though I love watching films, is there anything that you want to add? Any anecdotes? Anything special that you would like to add?
Hmm.
Things that I didn't think of asking.
Give us a moment.
Okay.
Think about it.
It's funny because, a conversation does tend, because of the nature of a conversation, does tend to go in a certain direction.
Right.
Your interest in more of the details surrounding certain chapters in Irmi's life and
Yeah.
the characters is, just its own direction. And I can't think of things that we've left out, that unless somebody were to ask, well, what's behind
Right.
that, or what's behind that, or was she really this, or was she really that?
Yeah.
I tend to think of the film in terms of all the creative moments of making it, and
Yes.
the collaborations, and the role of music, and the role of the
Right.
ways in which we move from in the different voices of the film. So
Mhm.
it's like, depending on the nature of the conversation, when
Right.
kind of one's mind. So
Yeah.
I'm more dependent on your questions than having
Okay.
the feeling that I need to say
Yeah.
something else about it.
Mhm.
But I might say, if I might, John, may I bring something up here?
Yes.
Yes.
Which does have to do with music, because I think that in filmic terms, that was the music is an important element in our film.
Yes.
And when we first cut the film, we worked with what is called found music. That is to say, we worked with Mozart, we worked with Schubert, we worked with Richard Tauber. We worked with found music that we thought was appropriate for the moment in the film. It was also music that I sort of knew that my mother loved, and it wasn't until we had our first edited version of the film that Susan, who's had more experience with this than I have, Susan said, we need a composer. And I thought, but we have all this beautiful music. Why do we need a composer? And Susan was very clear about the contribution that a composer can make by bringing up themes, repeating themes,
Right.
deepening a moment, really tailoring the music to the flow and the moments, the dramatic moments in the film, and the repetitions of themes. And that was a major contribution. And we worked with a wonderful, I think we both were so happy with our composer, Todd Buckelhide, who was a composer out here in the Bay Area. So that was one of the, we could have had a whole session just on the music.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out, because it's a very beautiful, I think, very beautiful element in the film. Excuse me, you wanted to say something.
Well, that was something that I was thinking too. I mean, I was thinking that what we've left, if there was something that we left out, I didn't know it's about Irmi, but it had more to do with the films, the things that mattered to us in the making of the film, creative, and I thought of the music. also. So
Yeah.
we were thinking similarly.
Yeah. So that's I did notice that there was an original that you had a composer working, which is amazing. There's also the animation, at least in the beginning, right? When you kind of like see Irmi's apartment with the animation, which was beautiful.
Yeah.
Added a lot, I thought.
Yeah, and that came, sometimes, they say something is the out of necessity, so invention out of necessity. I forget the expression, but we did want to include Irmi's apartment. We did want to somehow we came up with that's a nice way to start the film, but we had no images. We had no way of doing that in a way that was filmically satisfying. And so necessity is the mother of invention. That's what it is. And again, it was Susan's idea. We said, well, let's try to animate this. And that's how that came about. The drawings came because we didn't have images.
But we didn't have images, but we had a wonderful soundtrack of someone describing arriving at Irmi's apartment. And it was just so, this was so, it didn't remain in the film, but it was, that's another thing. There are these patinas, to a process. And sometimes what's left is the finished thing, but there's a whole history as to how you got there. But what sparked it was a friend who described what it was like to go and visit Irmi and what it was like to open the door and kind of walk into her apartment. And it was so charming and so true and so vivid that we used that description to give to the animator, so that, and with some pictures and everything, she was able to recreate it. It was amazing, just really lovely.
Yeah, it's I definitely got the feeling of warmth when like in the beginning when you see the apartment kind of open, or the animation of the apartment kind of open in front of your eyes, it really did give me a sense of warmth and kind of like just a really comfy and cozy apartment. That was really nice. I appreciated that. Yeah. And there is, of course, the whole issue, the whole thing of art throughout the movie. Just amazing art pieces and furniture in the apartment that they had in the helmets, which I think it was, you had pictures of it, right? That you could,
Yes,
you showed.
we did. We had photos of that. Yeah.
So yeah, before we say goodbye, I just want to take a moment and remind our audience that there are Holocaust survivor services out there for our Holocaust survivors. And I recommend Googling your local JFS or a Holocaust survivor program for more information about services in your area. And to conclude the interview, I want to thank you both, Susan Fanshel and Veronica Selver. Thank you so much for your time from the movie Irmi. Once again, thanks to all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all you film lovers for their continued support throughout all these years. And thank you to our audience for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival. Thank you so much.